The afternoon is called Getting to Yes with Yourself and Others. And of course, that's a huge wish. We all know it in our own conflicts, how much we wish to get to a yes. And even more so in global conflicts, so it answers a deep longing. And William Ury grew up as a boy in the USA when the threat of the Cold War was really strong. And even as a boy, he just couldn't understand how the fate of so many people and the world could be in the hand of a few decision makers that didn't seem to have very good communication skills. So he had a drive that really moved him forward into his life and actually ended up in the 80s, I believe, being a consultant to the White House, which had a crisis management center dedicated to building nuclear risk reduction centers in Moscow and Washington. So it's really an example, again, of how amazing life paths can be if we have a clear commitment and follow our core intelligence. William is also the co-founder of the Harvard Negotiation Project, out of which grew the International Negotiation Network, with on its council people like former President Jimmy Carter and Desmond Tutu. They've helped mediate many, many conflicts worldwide. He wrote the book Getting to Yes, together with Roger Fisher, which was published in 1981. And it sold more than 13 million copies worldwide, was translated into 35 languages, which says something about just how big the longing for this kind of knowledge is in the world. He's also founded in 2001 the e-Parliament, creating a space for government representatives to speak about things that are important to their hearts, that feel important in the world. And out of that grew the Climate Parliament, which helped lay the ground for the Paris Agreement that happened last November. He also founded the Abraham Path Initiative, which is a long-distance walking path moving through all the places that Abraham visited thousands of years ago and connects different countries and builds peace in the Middle East. Right now, he's deeply engaged in different places. He's just come very freshly from the Middle East. He's also just come back from Myanmar, where he was in conversation with Aung San Suu Kyi. And he's currently supporting President Santos in Colombia, who after 50 years of civil war is rebuilding peace in Colombia. And the last announcement is very special for the German speakers under us. Sein Buch ist gerade auf Deutsch übersetzt und gerade auf Deutsch herausgekommen. Wissen, was ich will und erfolgreich verhandeln. Der Einstieg ins Harvard-Konzept. Herzlichst empfohlen, ist gerade auf den Markt gekommen. So, a very, very warm welcome to William Ury.
From Colorado, and I see my friend Thomas there. And it's a wonderful occasion to celebrate life in intense times. And if I may, since Kasha was just mentioning the Middle East, let me begin, if I may, the conversation by offering up one of my favorite stories from the Middle East about negotiation, about a very difficult inheritance dispute in a family where a father left to his 3 sons 17 camels. To the oldest son, he left half the camels. To the middle son, he left 1/3 of the camels. And to the youngest son, he left 1/9 of the camels. Well, the 3 sons fell into a negotiation, and it wasn't so easy because 17 doesn't divide by 2, and it doesn't divide by 3, and it doesn't divide by 9. Each son wanted more. Things felt scarce, and they got into a bit of a brotherly fight, an argument. Tempers started to get heated, And finally, in desperation, they went and they consulted a wise old person. And the wise old person thought about their problem for a long time, and finally they came back and said, well, I don't know if I can help you, but if you want, you can have my camel. So then the three sons had 18 camels, and they said, okay. And then they began to try to divide it up. And 18 does divide by 2, so the first son took his half. Half of 18 is 9. 18 does divide by 3, so the middle son took his third, and that's 6. 18 does divide by 9, and the youngest took his ninth, which is 2. Well, if you add 9 and 6, you get 15. Plus 2, 17. They had one camel left over. They gave it back to the wise old person. Now, if you think about that story for a moment, I think you'll find it resembles a lot of the difficult conflicts that we get involved in. You start off with 17 camels. There is no way to resolve the situation. Somehow what we need to do, like that wise old person, is step back from the situation. I like to call it going to the balcony. Step back to a place of perspective, change our assumptions, and come up with an 18th camel. And that's what I'd like to talk with you about today, is how do we come up with those 18th camels? How do we take a step back from the situation? That's really been my life's passion, is really doing that, helping people do that, helping countries do that even in difficult situations. It's how do we get to yes? And as Kosha mentioned, it's been a question ever since I was a small boy of how do we human beings get to yes? I went on to study anthropology in university. And as an anthropologist, if we were looking at the world today, if an anthropologist, say, 1,000 years from now, we're looking back at this world today, they might notice a few things about the world. One thing they would notice is they might call this age the age of the human family reunion. In other words, it's the time when all 15,000 language groups on the face of the planet, all the 15,000 tribes, are for the first time we are in touch with each other. We are communicating with each other. We know there's one human family. And yet, like many family reunions, it is not all peace and light. There is feelings, powerful feelings. There's shadow. There's feelings of injustice, inequity, feelings of fear and anger and envy and scarcity. And so the question is, how do we learn to live together? Now, I can't help but notice that today is August 6th, which is the anniversary of an enormous tragedy for the human family, which was the bombing of Hiroshima back in 1945. From an anthropological point of view, from the point of view of looking at the story of humanity, the story of human evolution, this was a signal moment when human beings, for the first time, through our technological genius, were able to create the capacity to destroy not only human life, but perhaps all life on this planet, to put an end to this entire experiment, the opposite of celebrating life. And ever since then, there's been a race that started, a little bit like one of these races that's taking place in Rio today, in the Olympics. But it's a race for humanity between our ability, our technological capacity to come up with ways of destroying, and our moral, social, emotional, spiritual capacities to find ways to learn to live together in peace where there's enough for everyone. And that's the race we're engaged in, and that's why it's such a pleasure for me to participate in your conference together with Thomas about how do we find ways to affirm life, to celebrate life in the midst of these times of intensity. You know, in the last 3 or 4 decades, I've sort of seen myself a little bit like a scientist, and a wandering anthropologist who wanders around the world into different conflicts. Sometimes there are small conflicts among families or among couples or in organizations, businesses, but oftentimes my passion is conflicts that are where people are dying in war situations. And I worked during the Cold War. I worked in Chechnya and Russia and Yugoslavia and South Africa, Northern Ireland, many, many places, always asking myself, what's the secret to peace? What is the secret to peace? And, I think I actually found it. And it's not something miraculous. It's something extremely simple. It's right in front of our eyes all the time. The secret to peace is us. It's our own ability as a community to come together, to hold a conflict, to think about how do we transform a conflict from a destructive form where people are using violence to a constructive form where people are using dialogue, negotiation, nonviolent action, democratic means. And that's, to me, it's almost like the community acts a little bit like a cauldron that holds boiling water. And within that, like those old alchemists who could turn lead into gold, how do we turn the lead of human conflict and human shadow into gold, into light? And that, to me, is the role of the third side. And it is actually our oldest human heritage, if you think about it. I had, as an anthropologist, I had a privilege of spending time with some of the simplest indigenous societies on the planet, like, for example, the San Bushmen and the Kalahari. And if you think about the way in which they resolve conflict, it's very much this way. They don't see conflict as two-sided, as we do. We always see conflict as two sides, Arabs versus Israelis, husband versus wife, labor versus management. They see conflict always as having a third side. And that third side, of course, is us, the surrounding community. So, for example, the San Bushmen, traditionally they lived as hunters and gatherers, which was our form of life for 99% of the human story on the planet. And they hunt, and they use these poison-tipped arrows to hunt, poison that comes from a little beetle. So they know how dangerous it is, because if someone were to get angry and just pick up their arrow, then that other person is going to die, and they're going to die within 2 days, but long enough that they're going to have time to pick up their arrow and shoot someone else. And in a small community of maybe 25 or 30 people living in a larger network of 500, you lose 1, 2, 3, 4 people, that's a catastrophe. So what they've learned is, as the third side, is there's a kind of collective responsibility for the conflict. So when someone they hear, emotion's starting to go up, someone goes and hides the poison arrows out in the desert. Then all the people, all the women, the men, even the children sit around the campfire and they talk it out. They listen to each other. It may take a day, it may take 2 days or 3 days, but they don't rest until they get to the bottom of the issue. And it isn't enough just to resolve this particular dispute. There has to be a healing of the relationship. And so there has to be some forgiveness. There has to be some acknowledgement. There has to be some healing. And if people are not ready to heal yet, if anger is still high, then the elders suggest to the parties, why don't you go and visit some relatives in a neighboring watering hole? So there's a kind of cooling off. They have an entire system. And in my understanding, that kind of system is what allowed us as human beings to be alive to this time. That's our birthright. And the challenge that we face today is, how do we reinvent this third side in a way that can deal with our modern conflicts with 7 billion people on this planet? And that's my passion, is trying to figure that out. One thing I've noticed too in the last 30 or 40 years that I've been studying this process of negotiation. Now, negotiation I define very simply as back and forth communication. You're trying to reach agreement, and you have some interests which you perhaps hold in common, like an ongoing relationship, but you have other interests which are in tension with each other, and the question is, how do you reach agreement? Over the last 30, 40 years, I've watched a quiet revolution taking place around the world. It's a revolution that accompanies the knowledge revolution, that accompanies the communications revolution. It's a revolution in the way in which we as individuals, we as organizations, we as communities, as societies, the way in which we make decisions. Because traditionally, a generation or more ago, the main way to deal with conflicts or to deal with decisions was the people on the top of the pyramids of power. They gave the orders, and the people on the bottom simply followed the orders. But now, thanks to the knowledge revolution, we're seeing those pyramids of power slowly flatten themselves into networks. We live and work in networks that more resemble the networks where the decision-making goes from vertical decision-making to horizontal decision-making. And another name for horizontal decision-making is negotiation. Hence, I think, why negotiation is such a topic of strong interest today in universities, in organizations, in the world. We're living through a revolution I call the negotiation revolution. You might think about it in your own life for a moment. Just imagine if I were to ask you a few quick questions. Think about who you negotiate with in the course of your day. In other words, who do you engage with in back and forth communication? You're trying to reach agreement. It might be your kids, your friends, your parents, people in your family, or it might be at work. It might be with your coworkers or people who report to you or your boss or your board. It might be partners. It might be customers or clients or suppliers. You think about all the people with whom you engage in back and forth communication trying to reach agreement and ask yourself the question, how much of your time do you spend engaged, broadly speaking, in this process of back and forth communication? In other words, negotiation, trying to reach an agreement with all those people. Think about what percentage would you give that? Now, normally when I ask that question, a lot of people say, well, it's 25% of my time, or even 50% of my time, or even 75% of my time. And then if you add to it negotiating with yourself, that internal negotiation, which is perhaps the first and most fundamental negotiation, we're negotiating all the time from the moment we get up in the morning to the moment we go to bed at night, and even perhaps during our dreams, we're negotiating with ourselves. So ask yourself for a moment then, think about the last 10 years of your life. Would you say the amount of negotiating that you're doing has pretty much stayed the same? Has it tended to go down over time, perhaps as you've gotten more authority in your own organization at work and so on? Or has it gone up? I think most of you, at least my experience with asking this question around the world, is almost everyone says it's going up. And that's the negotiation revolution. That doesn't mean that there's less conflict. There's probably more conflict in the world today. And I think, actually, personally, that's not entirely a bad thing. Because I don't think of conflict as being necessarily bad. Conflict is part of life. The question is not about eliminating conflict. The question is whether we choose to deal with that conflict in destructive ways, through hurting each other, through hurting family relationships, breaking off, through hurting each other physically, through courts, through war, or whether we handle those conflicts constructively, through listening to each other, through dialogue, through trying to find solutions, through negotiation, through democracy. That, to me, is the great choice that faces us today. And what I'd like to do, if I may, is just share with you a few, perhaps, simple principles for how we go about negotiating. Because one of the things that strikes me as interesting, now that the Olympics are going on, is, imagine you were engaging in your favorite sport, your favorite, whether it's swimming or running or whatever your favorite sport is, 50% of your time. In other words, the amount of time that we may spend negotiating. You probably would be in Rio today engaging in your favorite sport. So why aren't we, the question I ask myself is, why aren't we all in the negotiation Olympics? And I think the answer to that question is when we engage in our favorite sport, we always have part of our mind focused on how do I improve the technique? How do I do it better? We focus on the process. But when it comes to negotiation, we have almost all of our attention focused on the outcome, the terms and conditions, the dollars and cents, the euros. What's the amount? What's the outcome? What's the result? But if we can learn to be reflective negotiators, if we can learn to be on the balcony, and we can learn from each one of our negotiations, then we can practice the art of continuous improvement, and we may have a chance of getting into the negotiation Olympics. And I think actually, if we're going to deal with the conflicts and all the crises that we face today, the world as a whole, we need to be able to go to the negotiation Olympics. So what are some basic principles? To me, interestingly enough, as I think back over the last 3 or 4 decades that I've been involved in this quest of how can human beings deal with each other and deal with our differences, the thing that's perhaps most struck me is that the single biggest obstacle to us getting what we want in life, and that's what negotiation is. It's a method for getting what we want, for meeting our needs. The single biggest obstacle is not what we think it is. We often think it's a difficult person, that difficult family member, that parent, that child, that boss, that coworker, that client, or that society, those people. Actually, I find that as difficult as they can sometimes be, the most difficult person we ever have to deal with is the person we look at in the mirror every morning. It's this person right here. This is the most difficult person I have to deal with. And so, human beings, we are reaction machines. And as the old saying goes, when angry, you will make the best speech you will ever regret. And that happens more often than we think. So to me, the foundation of successful negotiation, which will not be at all new to those of you there, is the ability to imagine yourself on a stage, like you're negotiating on a stage, and part of you goes to a mental and emotional, maybe even a spiritual balcony, a place of calm, perspective, of clarity, where you can observe the situation, where you can remember what is truly important to you. What are your core interests? What do you really need? Where you can see the bigger picture, where you can listen to the other. That to me is kind of key, is that ability to go to the balcony. Because in today's world, we all have these little devices here, and we're getting texts and emails and phone calls, and it's very easy to get reactive. Like you get an email from a colleague at work, and you feel you've been left out of an important decision, and you get angry. And so it's very tempting to just compose a reply, and then you get the satisfaction of hitting the reply button. But you don't just hit the reply button, you hit the reply all button, and then it goes to everybody in the organization. And you see conflicts start to escalate. There's a little button on the screen that we rarely use that I think of as the balcony button. It's the one that says save as draft. That's the one where you compose your reply and then you save as a draft. Then you go to the balcony. Some of us, I love to go for walks. Some of us love to work out, or you might meditate, or whatever technique you use to go to a place of perspective. You're going to come back then afterwards. Look at that email and ask yourself the vital question you ask yourself from the balcony is, will this advance the situation? Will this advance what I need or what we need, what the situation is calling for? And more likely than not, you're going to hit the delete button, and then you'll pick up the phone, call the person, and see if you can get together and resolve the situation. So to me, that's key. And if I may, I'll just offer you just one example where that got confirmed for me when I was involved in a very difficult negotiation. Some years ago, I was in the country of Venezuela. I'd been invited by President Carter and the United Nations to talk to the government and the opposition at a time when there were 1 million people on the streets of Caracas demanding the resignation of President Hugo Chavez, and 1 million people on the streets supporting him, and there was some violence, and international observers were worried that might even lead to civil violence, perhaps even a civil war. Anyway, I had some meetings, but with President Chavez, but one in particular I remember where he liked to meet at night. It was 9 p.m. at night in his presidential palace. And I waited there patiently with my colleague Francisco, and 10, 11, midnight, finally we're ushered in to see the president, expecting to find him alone, but in fact he had his entire cabinet arrayed behind him. And he offered me a seat and he said, so William, he said, tell me, what do you think of the situation here in Venezuela? And I said, well, Mr. President, I've been speaking to some of your ministers. I've been speaking to some of the leaders of the opposition. I think there's a little bit of progress. Well, that was apparently the wrong thing to say, because as soon as he heard the word progress, he got extremely angry. He started yelling and saying, you're a fool. You're not seeing all the tricks the other side, the opposition is up to. They're traitors. You're naive. You're not seeing things. And he leaned in very close to my face and proceeded to shout at me for approximately 30 minutes. Now, I was thinking, oh, all my work over a year and a half down the drain. I was feeling a little embarrassed in front of all the ministers and so on. But I was able at that moment, a friend of mine once had said, William, if you're ever in a very difficult situation, just pinch the palm of your hand. And I said, Hernan, why would I pinch the palm of my hand? He said, because that will give you a momentary pain and will keep you alert. It was a way to go to the balcony. So for whatever reason, I remembered to pinch the palm of my hand at that moment. And I went to the balcony, and on the balcony, you ask yourself, I was able to observe my own feelings and emotions and feel my cheeks reddening and so on. So I was able to watch myself for a moment, and that helped me detach a little bit. But I was also able to ask myself the important question, which was, I felt like reacting and explaining, I'm not a fool, this and that, the other thing. But then I realized, is it really going to advance my goal, which is trying to calm the situation, bring some peace to the situation, to get into an argument with the president of Venezuela? And I realized the answer to that was no. And, President Chavez was famous for being able to give 8-hour speeches. So I'm sure if I had gotten into an argument with him, we could have gone all night, and that would have been the end. But instead, I just decided to listen, from a balcony perspective, to listen and to watch and to see the drama that was going on in front of me, and watch him and just listen, nod my head. And after 30 minutes of just being kind of just listening to him, I finally was watching President Chavez's body language, and I saw his shoulders sink very slightly. And in a weary tone of voice, he said to me, so Yuri, what should I do? Well, that is the faint sound of the human mind opening. Because before that, if you tried to reason with someone who's in an angry state of mind, it's like beating your head against the wall. You're not going to get very far. I was just listening, waiting for when there was a slight opening. And then I said, once he asked me, what should I do? I said, well, I think, Mr. President, I believe the entire country of Venezuela needs to go to the balcony because it's almost Christmas time. Last Christmas, all the festivities were canceled because of the crisis, because of the conflict. Why not just give everyone a break, enjoy the family holidays, tregua, truce for 3 weeks, and then in January come back, maybe everyone will be in a better mood to listen. He said, that's an excellent idea. I'm going to propose that in my next speech. And his mood had completely shifted. In fact, he said, over Christmas, I'm going to travel around the country, and I'd like you to come around with me and travel and see this country. And then he thought for a moment. He said, oh, yes, but you're neutral. Maybe it wouldn't be so good for you to be seen always in my company. But no worries, I'll give you a disguise. What I learned from that is that the single greatest power that you have as a negotiator is the ability not to react, is the ability to go to the balcony, is the ability to listen to the other side. And this to me is really the core, is that if we're going to try to get to yes with others, the first person we need to get to yes with is ourselves. I needed to get to yes with myself first in that situation before I could possibly get to yes with President Chavez. So for me, going to the balcony and, speaking to an audience that understands many ways of going, you all have your favorite techniques. That to me is like the foundation of successful negotiation. If I might just add a second principle. So from the balcony, what do you then do? To me, if you think about negotiation, the process of getting to yes, it's a process of influence. You're trying, in a sense, to help the other person change their mind, as it were. But how can we possibly change someone's mind if we don't know where their mind is? And not just their mind, their emotions, and so on. So for me, maybe the core principle is the ability in negotiation to be able to put yourself in the shoes of the other person and understand what it's like to be in their shoes. And it's not an easy process to do. It's a process of empathy, because after all, in negotiation, if you're trying, how can you possibly move someone in some direction unless you know what they want, where they are, where they're coming from? And the core process for doing that is the process of listening. And there's a saying that we're given one mouth and two ears for a reason, which is to listen twice as much as we talk. And if you observe the behavior of successful negotiators, you find that they listen far more than they talk. We think of negotiation as talking, but it's really, at its core, about listening. And listening, I don't just mean listening to the words, hearing the words, because it's almost like there's a voice. And I mean, if you think about listening, for much of us, when we listen, there's a little voice, that little judge saying, I don't agree with that person. I agree with that. I don't agree with that. That's not the kind of listening I'm talking about. It's a kind of a listening where you listen behind the words, for the feelings, for the emotions, for what is really going on in that situation. You don't just listen to what's being said, you listen to what's not being said. It's a deeper kind of empathetic listening that is called for in these situations. And to me, it's interesting that, we teach our children mathematics and literature and all these things, language, but there are very, very few courses in listening, in training our natural human listening abilities and honing them. And yet that's the key to human relationship. That's the key to negotiation, is the ability to listen deeply from a balcony perspective to the other side, to all the different parties, to the situation itself, is that ability to listen. So that's maybe a second core skill of negotiation. And if I might add a third one might be in negotiation, in any negotiation, whether it's small or large, we tend to focus on positions. In other words, what people say they want, like the dollars and cents, the euros, the result that you want, the position, the thing you say you want. But the key in negotiation, I find, is the ability to look behind the positions, and this is where listening and balcony come into play, or what's underneath the positions. What are the underlying interests or needs or concerns or fears? Let me just give you a simple example. There was a woman who lived in the United States a little more than a century ago, and she... There oftentimes people say the father of modern management was a man named Peter Drucker. Well, Peter Drucker said the mother of modern management was this woman whose name was Mary Parker Follett. And she was once in a Harvard library just observing two students get into a quarrel. One wanted the window open and the other one wanted it closed. So one would go and open the window, the other would go slam it shut, and they kept on doing that and bothered everyone in the library. So finally the librarian comes over and she asks the first student, well, why do you want the window open? He says, because I want some fresh air. So she asks the second one, why do you want the window closed? He says, well, the wind is blowing my papers around. So then she asks them the question, well, how do we get you fresh air without you a draft? They have a little bit of a conversation, and one of them says, I've got an idea. And he disappears into the room next door and opens a window there, thus providing fresh air for the first person without a draft for the second. Now, in that very simple situation, think about what's going on. You start off with two positions, open window and closed window. By asking the magical question, why, the librarian is able to move the attention from the positions to the underlying interests, which in this case are fresh air and no draft. And then they're able to come up with an open window in the next room, a creative solution that meets both sides' interests. Note that it's not just a split the difference compromise. When we think of negotiation, we think, okay, it's a half-open window. That's the compromise. We have to compromise. But notice that in this case, a half-open window would not have satisfied either one because it would have been too much draft and not enough fresh air. What you find successful negotiators doing constantly is they're constantly looking behind people's positions for what they really want, for their underlying interests, and then coming up with solutions that are a little bit like that open window in the next room, a little bit like that 18th camel. Let me just give you an example, if I may. Some years ago, I was working with a civil war taking place in Indonesia around the area known as Aceh. And I was meeting with the commanders of the Achenese Liberation Front at one point. And I said, you've been fighting for independence for 25 years. There are thousands of people dead. I understand your position. It's independence. That's what you are fighting for. That's your position. Tell me a little more about what are your interests. And there was a little bit of a silence, a kind of an awkward silence in the room, because I realized that, and this is like us all the time, is we know our position, we know what we want, but do we know why we really want what we want? Do we know that underlying why? And they were clear about their position, but they weren't so clear about their interests. And I was interested. I mean, do you have is it a political interest that you want to rule yourself? That's why you want independence? Is it economic interest? You want to have control over your natural resources? Is it a cultural interest? You want your children to go to school in your own language? Is it a symbolic interest? You want a seat at the United Nations? And it was interesting, that conversation. But by moving from positions to interests, we could then ask, okay, so you're going to war here, you're fighting, you're using war. Why do we fight? We fight to advance our interests. So, they could see that, I said, how likely are you to win this war? And they said, no, listen, the Indonesian army is much more powerful than us. Even in 10 years, 20 years, we probably won't win. I said, but maybe even if you don't, what can you do to advance your interests? In other words, your political interests, your cultural interests, your economic interests, your symbolic interests. How could you advance that? One way is by war, which is not, just going to end up with losses for both sides. The other way is perhaps by negotiating, a self-rule arrangement, an autonomy arrangement where you can advance your political interests of self-rule, advance your economic interests, advance your cultural interests, and so on. And you don't even have to give up your long-term aspiration of independence. You can hold that for the future. Well, that began, you saw some people began to think about that and began a process within the movement of really examining what's the best way to advance your interests. Is it through war or is it through negotiation? That's the strategic choice. And a few years later, they were able to reach agreement with the Indonesian government on an autonomy arrangement. And it was interesting, they had their elections, and the very first elections, the governor, the vice governor, the legislature were the very people who were fighting the independence struggle. So they were able to advance their interests without using violence. And to me, that's the great challenge that faces humanity right now, is to be able to do that. The great challenge underlying all of these things, of going to the balcony, of listening to the other side, of focusing on the interest behind the position so you can come up with the equivalent of an open window in the next room, is, to me, the greatest power that you have is the power to change the game. To change the game from a confrontation in which we're, face-to-face confrontation, we're glaring, it's like we're sitting on opposite sides of the table, or we're using violence. How do we change the game to a cooperative, we're both on the same side of the table, facing a problem in all its difficulties, but facing it jointly? We're going from face to face to side by side, jointly attacking the problem rather than attacking each other, using nonviolent means rather than violent means for dealing with conflict. So that's, to me, the key. I could go on, but I really want to pause and see if there are some questions here. I could talk about different situations, like, for example, I've just, the last 5 years, as Kosha was mentioned, I've been working in the country of Colombia. And Colombia, as many of you know, has been going through over 50 years of civil war. There are hundreds of thousands of people, 200,000, 300,000. Some people say 1 million people have died in this struggle. There are 6 million refugees, internally displaced people. The trauma has been intense. And when President Santos asked me to come talk to him 5 years ago, there had not been any negotiations really in 10 years. And most people thought the chances of a peace agreement were 1%, 2%, 3%. They didn't think it was possible. But I watched, and I've now gone to Colombia maybe 20 times over every few months to accompany this process, and gone to Cuba and met with the FARC on the other side. But I've watched as they looked behind their positions. They were able to go a little bit to the balcony, look behind their positions for what their underlying true interests were, and see if they could find some way to put an end to 50 years of war. And now within a month or two, I think there will be a final end to this war. Right now there is a bilateral ceasefire. Things are more peaceful there in Colombia than they've been in 50 years. And to me, it's an example of hope, because that war in Colombia is not just one place. When that war in Colombia comes to an end, as it's coming, it means that's the last war in the entire hemisphere, in the entire Western hemisphere. That's the last major armed conflict in the entire hemisphere. When that comes to an end, it shows you that if it is possible to put an end to war in one hemisphere, why cannot we at least imagine the possibility of putting war to an end in both hemispheres, in the entire world? And that's the hope that I cherish at this particular moment.
Well, first of all, hello, William. So good to see you.
Hey, Dennis, it's a real pleasure.
It's so great. I could go on listening to you for hours, I guess. It's so fascinating to hear your practical life experience on negotiation. It's fantastic. So thank you so much for your presentation, first of all. And secondly, I have maybe one or two questions, or maybe a little bit more. But then maybe we will also give the possibility for someone to ask here in the audience. One question I have when I listen to you is, can you say a little bit more about the moment where we decide, or where we have the freedom to decide to go to the balcony? What are the ingredients of people? Because once there is this option that in a conflict I have actually the option to opt out. Like I have enough conscious awareness around the process to even recognize that I'm in it, that there's another possibility. The possibility is called balcony. So that's already a great thing. But what helps us human beings to increase the chances for that moment to happen? Do you have any guidance on that?
Well, first of all, I would say the work that you are doing and all the people probably in the audience are doing. In other words, the work of the difficult work of working on ourselves, of understanding our shadow, of studying, learning to cultivate silence. All those things are critical. This is why I think there's a unity of this work, that the work inside to me is critical to being able to go to the balcony in those difficult situations. What helps me go to the balcony, if I just speak personally, is the work that I've done over the years to kind of try and quiet my mind. Because in those moments of intensity, it's very hard to go to the balcony unless I've already laid the foundations. And for me, it's the work that we do every single day to get to yes inside of ourselves. In other words, and I'll give you, it's being able to go to the balcony. You know, for example, as I say, one of the keys is listening. So what blocks us from being able to listen to the other empathetically, even though we know it's the right thing to do, it's the effective thing to do? Why is it that we find it so hard to do it? And I think the answer to that is that we haven't first learned how to listen to ourselves. And that, in other words, and that's the practices of whether it's meditation, but it's, deep psychological work, but learn to listen to ourselves. If we've learned to listen to ourselves, learn to observe our own emotions, our own thoughts, learn what grabs us, where do we get identified, where are our hot buttons. If we can learn to do that, and we can learn to clear our mind a little bit, then there's going to be a little bit of our space to be able to take in the other human being and take in other human beings. But if all of that's going on inside here is just mind chatter, emotional chatter, everything like that, there's no space for us to listen to the other side. And so for me, it's about creating that space, that emptiness, that we can actually receive other human beings or receive, a conflict as large as the tragedy going on in Syria today. Or receive what's happening with ISIS, receive the phenomenon of terrorism. We have to clear ourselves to be able to receive that and create space, because to me goes back to the third side. If there's a conflict going on, it's not being resolved, it's because the third side, which is this human capacity, this collective capacity for peacemaking, is not yet strong enough. The way we strengthen it is by doing that inner work. And I'll just say, too, what I've begun to realize is I focus my life in some ways, on getting to yes, which is helping people get to agreements that are good for both sides or for all sides. But I've realized that actually that's quite difficult in today's world in a lot of circumstances for people to do. And the reason it is because we are not paying attention to the prior stage. The prior stage to getting to yes with the other is this stage of getting to yes with yourself. Before we can get to a win with the other, there has to be an inner victory, an inner win, a self-mastery. And that actually permits, if that's the first stage, is that inner win, and then the second stage is a win-win. To me, in this world today, we can't stop at win-win. We have to go beyond win-win to what I would call a win-win-win, which is a win for the whole, a win for the whole community, the whole society. We cannot just pretend that there's not a war going on in Syria and then we find what the results are. We have to find a way to include the whole, the community, life itself in our interactions. And so there are like three stages. There's the internal win, which is the work, we're talking about, that sets us up to be able to go to the balcony and get to win-win. But we have to go way beyond that to in this world today, if we're going to survive, if we're going to thrive, if we're going to deal with the nuclear threat, if we're going to deal with, climate change, we need to increasingly think of there being a third win, which is a win for the whole.
Yes, I find this fascinating. Also that you bring in this aspect of the whole, that it needs to be reflected in the whole as part of the restoration process. And so what I'm hearing is that there is that the capacity to make inner space is the capacity, in my understanding, to create intimacy. And you said it beautifully, if I put myself into that bigger space, if I embed myself in a bigger perspective in life, I have space for another person. So now, my question is, how do you see that you as like a mediator that works in conflict resolution, that you provide that space for people that don't have that space at the moment?
Yeah, I mean, it's not that I provide it, but I kind of, it's provided through me, let's put it that way.
Right.
I think that's true. It goes back to presence, which is what can I bring to a situation, or what can we, and this is where the third side, I mean, the essential role of the third side to me is to be a witness. Not just a detached witness, but an engaged witness. And that's that witnessing, that presence is what I can bring, which is, it's a communication that takes place well beyond words, but it's just a kind of a quieting of the situation. And a reminding, to me, the prime role of the third side is to help people, the parties, go to the balcony and remember that there's something larger at stake. I mean, right now, I've just come back from a few weeks ago from working on the conflict in Syria, and which is, just huge tragedy. It's taking place every single day. It sometimes goes off of our news feed, and then we come back to it. But it's unbelievable. I've had the privilege of visiting Syria a number of times before the war, and knowing it brings it into, somehow makes it more come alive for me. But but the question is, where's the third side here? Where is the third side, which is the will to peace, the kind of the humanity's ability to take collective responsibility for this conflict, to say it's not over there, it's right here, it's ours. And we actually have a role to play as engaged witnesses, and to say, it is totally unacceptable in today's times for this kind of carnage to be taking place. It is utterly unacceptable. And I believe there are ways that if we can mobilize that third side externally, we can support the third side within Syria. And then, of course, there's an inner third side, which is within every one of us, which is that ability to go to the balcony. And if we can make that strong enough, then slowly that conflict can transform itself from its current violent form to a much more constructive form.
Wow, that's a beautiful, first of all, I really love what you're saying. And it's, what I hear is also that, first of all, that your role in a conflict mediation is also like providing the intimacy for both sides to meet, which brings in space. But basically what I hear more than that is that we entering as humanity enough responsibility that we pay enough attention to be that third side for our world's events. So basically we could be that all the time. Yes.
Yeah, I think all of us. That to me is what I learned from the San Bushmen, is that they don't see conflict as belonging to the parties. Conflict is a phenomenon of the community. And so it's the community responsibility. It doesn't mean the community, it's not about responsibility in the sense of blame. It's responsibility in terms of responsibility, the ability to respond to the situation in a constructive way. So the friends, the allies, the bystanders, the neighbors, the community plays an incredibly important role in creating the container within which the conflict can be transformed.
beautiful. I think that's such a great vision also for humanity as such, that in a kind of an inner spiritual practice, in a presence in practice that also is available for collective dynamics, we more and more could actually provide that intimacy for stuff that's happening right now in the world. And so I love that very much. And maybe my last question, and then I would love to give it a bit to the audience. I know that you're like deeply, I don't know, inspired, or that the story of Abraham was an important story in your life. And maybe you can share a bit about the spiritual meaning of your understanding of the calling of Abraham, and why the Abraham path became such an important project for you, but what that's also, as a spiritual meaning for you. I loved in our conversation how full of fire you shared about that. So maybe you can share it here as well.
Sure, with pleasure. The Abraham path is one of my great passions, so I'm delighted to be able to share. It was, I've worked in the Middle East, in the politics of the Middle East ever since the 70s, and ever since even the very first Camp David agreement between the United States, between Israel and Egypt. And but after the attacks in 9/11 and the Iraq War, I was just kind of sitting here reflecting, maybe where's the 18th camel? How do we think out of the box here? And as an anthropologist, I've always deeply appreciated the power of story, the power of narrative. There's an old saying that some conflicts are so difficult that only a story can heal them. And so that led me to kind of reflect on the story of Abraham, because as an anthropologist, we know that every culture has an origin story. And the origin story of the Middle East, in fact, the most widely shared origin story on the face of the planet, shared by over half of humanity, is this story of a journey of a man named Abraham who hears a call to go forth. And in fact, in Hebrew, it's lech lecha. It means go find yourself. That's what it means, go find yourself, which is, we're all, in fact, even the name Abraham just means, I think it means the higher aspect. So it's basically a metaphor for the soul's journey. The stories about Abraham which are stories. So I went back and looked at these stories, and the stories of Abraham are, he was a boy. He was like asking questions, like, people were worshiping statues or worshiping, the planets, and he was saying, yeah, but what's behind the statues? Who creates the statues? What's behind the planets? And he has this insight, which we now have too, which is the insight that in fact behind unity, that's kind of an invisible unifying presence, and he has that insight, and then he hears this. He learns to listen to himself. He hears this call, and he goes on a journey. And what does he discover on this journey? Is he discovers that because of, if everything is one, if that's the insight, then what's the basic relationship of one human being to another? There is no separation. We're one. And so he learns to receive hospitality and to give hospitality. He's known in all the different faiths as the person who had his tent open in all four directions to receive perfect strangers, to wash the feet of perfect strangers even. And if you think about hospitality, it's something more than what we normally think of as hospitality. Hospitality, in one sense, is the essence of our humanity. It's the ability to receive the other, receive the stranger, and receive them as if, they're an expression of the divine, basically. And So he's known for hospitality. And so he represents, in some sense, the unity in the midst of perhaps the most divided region on the planet, the Middle East. He represents the point of unity, that we're all one family, all human beings. It doesn't have to be just, Jews, Christians, Muslims, but everyone. He's considered kind of like the origin of humanity, in some sense, the father of humanity or the mother of humanity. But it's and what he symbolizes is kindness towards strangers, and if you think so anyway, the more I studied that, I asked, so how do we bring that spirit, that story back alive today? Because it's kind of buried, it's a little forgotten. And since I love to walk, I thought, why not a walk that kind of retraces this ancient journey? And I, as we studied it, my colleagues and I studied it, it's a journey actually that's remembered all through the Middle East, all from ancient Mesopotamia to modern day, to the Promised Land, to Israel, Palestine, but he goes to Egypt, and in the Islamic narrative, he goes to Mecca. He's actually responsible for the Hajj, and in Mecca. So his journey actually goes through 10 different countries, and so it was kind of a crazy idea back then, about 10 years ago or more, to say, well, could we recreate that journey a little bit like Santiago de Compostela, a little Santiago de Compostela in the Middle East, as a way to help us remember our humanity, remember our common humanity, remember our humanity by experiencing hospitality. And the amazing thing I've found in the last 10 years, obviously it's been quite a difficult period in the Middle East to work, but with an idea like that, we don't see ourselves as creating something new. We see ourselves as dusting off the footsteps. That's it. We're just simply dusting off the footsteps. And as someone who practices conflict resolution, what attracted to me this idea was paths can last many, many generations. Like Compostela has lasted over 1,000 years. So however long the conflicts in the Middle East last, this path will outlast those conflicts. And in the last 10 years, very practically now, to this day, with the help of our local teams and people in the area, there are now over 2,000 kilometers of path that have been mapped out, retracing this ancient journey in the Middle East in 5 different countries in the Middle East. There are thousands of people, mostly people from the Middle East, who are walking these paths again. And the amazing thing that you find when you go there is you think, as a Westerner, you think you're going to find hostility, but you find the most amazing hospitality that is still offered in the name of Ibrahim, of Abraham. That's the Arabic name for Abraham, is Ibrahim. It's the simplest person needs to give you something because they need to. You pass a tent, they invite you into their tent. You've spent a lot of time in the Middle East, so you've experienced that incredible spirit of hospitality that in the midst of all this conflict still exists there. So to me, fundamentally, the path of Abraham is a walk from no to yes, from a no to the other to a yes to the other, from a no to life to a yes to life, from fear to hope, from separation to connection. And it's a way, if you think about the path, it's like a giant balcony. It's a place where you can get perspective. It's like it's a giant listening place, a place where you can encounter the other, listen to the other, see the other, understand the other in a way you would never otherwise do. And it's a way to change the fundamental game from destructive conflict to constructive cooperation, from terrorism to tourism. And I'm amazed to see that the path has taken root. The place where it's most deeply embedded right now is in Palestine, the place you least expect, but there's a waymarked path from the north of Palestine to the south. The World Bank has come in and begin to support the path in Palestine because they see this as an innovation in socioeconomic cooperation. They see how it builds social cohesion. Paths have all these enormous beneficial effects. And National Geographic magazine, I have it right here actually, last year they published an episode here of the 10 best new walking trails in the world. And one of them is in Provence, and one of them is around the Himalayas, and one of them is in Tuscany. And the number one path in the world was, see if I can find it here, is the number one path in the world is the Abraham Path. That's what they said was the best new walking path in the world. So,
first of all, I love all the wisdom that comes through when you speak. And secondly, I find it lovely that people had time to memorize the path behind you while they were talking. So that's great. Right. Maybe there's a few minutes left. Maybe if you want, we can maybe see if there are questions in the audience, and we can maybe have one or two questions if there are. So let's see if we have some questions. Yeah, let's start with Robin, and then maybe also.
Thank you so much, William. I'm very touched by your talk and your experience. And in my experience, we often learn as much from our failures as from our successes. And I wonder, so I have a little two-part question in a way. One is whether you would reflect with us a bit about the most challenging situations you've been in where, in a sense, you might consider that you failed as a mediator and kind of what you learned from that. And in a way linked to that is whether you feel it is always possible to get to yes, or are sometimes our interests or the interests of the parties really irreconcilable?
Really good questions. Well, first of all, I would have to say that as a mediator, I failed more than I've succeeded. Because I like to challenge myself. I mean, to me, I visit all these places, work in all these places around the world. I like to challenge. Early on, I learned that it wasn't enough just to sit in the university and think of good ideas, but you need to test them out in the most difficult laboratories in the world, the places where it is actually hardest. And so that's what I've done over the last. I've gone to the places which are the hardest knots in the world, which is why, right now I'm just came back from working on Syria, which seemed like hopeless causes. And so there's always a lot of failure. There's a lot more, at least apparent failure, than there is success. I sometimes take courage from my fellow mediator, George Mitchell, who was the mediator in Northern Ireland, who sat there listening to Catholics and Protestants for, like 700 days as they were just arguing with each other. And he likes to say I had, 699 days of failure and 1 day of success. And that's often what it looks like. But just to reflect on some failures. I remember just how frustrating it can sometimes be to watch. You can see where the parties could actually reach an agreement and it could save lives, and suddenly it slips out of your hands. I worked in the 90s as a third-party facilitator between the Russian government and the leaders of Chechnya. And my colleagues and I were, successful in helping to bring about an initial ceasefire that lasted for about a year. But then I watched as that untangled and then went back into war, and I could see just all the destruction. But it was extremely difficult to watch and to feel that things could have been done to prevent it. And that's, to me, one of the great lessons I take from the last is increasingly, just as we're moving from curative medicine to preventive medicine, I think we need to make that same move when it comes to dealing with conflicts. It's not just picking up the pieces of putting an end to wars, but actually prevention. And increasingly, we know how to prevent. A lot of it has to do with mobilizing the third side within the country itself and the external third side. But we can prevent before things get too bad. Because once the war, the blood is shed, it becomes infinitely more difficult to remedy. So coming back to your second question, which is, are there situations where the interests are so irreconcilable that people cannot reach agreement? Yes, there are in the moment. Yes, at this particular moment, it seems they're not reconcilable. That doesn't mean that in the future, things couldn't change. But that's why in negotiation, one of the things we teach, one of the most important things to ask yourself in any negotiation is from a balcony perspective, to ask yourself, how am I going to advance my interests if for some reason I am not able to reach agreement right now with the other side? We call this your BATNA, your best, it's an acronym standing for your best alternative to a negotiated agreement, your BATNA. And it turns out to be key. You know, if you're looking for a job, if you don't get one job, you get another job. But you have to, you know, because the purpose of negotiation is to advance your interests. And you always need to look at what your alternatives are. And this actually goes back to getting to yes with yourself, because what I've found is, curiously enough, if you're able to go to the balcony and ask yourself, what's your inner BATNA? In other words, can you take care of yourself irrespective of what happens with the negotiation? It will help you feel a sense of freedom and confidence that paradoxically will make it easier for you to reach agreement. Because the more dependent we are on the other side to reach an agreement, the more constricted it gets. If we can find that inner freedom and say, look, I care, I really would like to reach agreement, but I don't fundamentally absolutely need to. I'm not a hostage to the situation. Then actually it makes it a lot easier. So again, it comes back to the inner work. If we can develop our own inner BATNA, which is our own inner commitment to take care of our needs, to take responsibility for ourselves, irrespective of what the other person does, then not only may we find another alternative, in fact, if our interests are irreconcilable, but actually we're more likely to reach an agreement with the other side. And the last thing I'll say is, when I started, in this field in the 70s, there were the conflicts that were widely considered to be impossible. They were just too intractable. There was the Cold War, and people said, the Berlin Wall is going to be there for generations. That's what everyone said. And then I made many trips to the Soviet Union back and forth, and I watched as the process happened by which the Berlin Wall came to an end. The Cold War came to an end. We also were working on South Africa back then, and people said, oh, there's just going to be carnage in South Africa between blacks and whites for as long as you can imagine. And I went to South Africa, and I watched as blacks and whites found a way, almost miraculously, to find a way forward. And then the same thing between Catholics and Protestants in Northern Ireland. We worked on that. People said, no, they've been fighting for centuries, and, it's religious in nature, and, said all these things, it's impossible. But then I watched as that conflict, too, moved in a much more peaceful direction. So all I can say is I've seen enough situations where what people thought was absolutely impossible, things were absolutely intractable, and yet they yielded to patient, persistent negotiation, that I now believe that, yes, maybe right now things seem very difficult in Syria, but I can tell you the conflict in Syria will come to an end. The question is, can we accelerate the process? And to me, that's the great question. Are we going to allow this conflict to go on for another few years, 100,000 lives every year? Can we really allow that to happen? Or are we going to really engage as a third side in a constructive way to help the third side within Syria, the people of Syria themselves, forge an agreement where they can live together again?
Yes. Okay. Do you have still time for one more question? Or William?
Sure, absolutely. I have as much time as you want.
Great. So let's have one more question. That was over there, I think.
Thank you very much. It was very touching and inspiring, and part of my question was already answered in the last part, because what I liked even more than the stories and what you told was your spark and your passion, and how can I put the question? So, can you tell me how do you feed your spark? How do you keep this fire? How this passion?
Yeah, this is the paradox. I find that I keep the spark alive by going into the places of despair. By not just, I live in these mountains. I live in Colorado. I live on a balcony, in the mountains. That's my place of refuge. But I find that I keep the spark partly by, I get inspired a lot by nature and, by my own inner work. I love to walk in the beauty. But I keep the spark alive also by going into the places of darkness. And oddly enough, this is what I find, is that when I go, for example, into the Middle East, and I go there regularly, I go there every year to walk along the new Abraham path, the Masad Ibrahim in the Middle East. I went to walk in the Sinai actually not long ago. Is oddly enough, in the places where we imagine in the West, how can you go into this place of danger? I feel this incredible sense of safety, and I don't know how to explain it, but somehow when we sit here and we watch what's going on, whether it's in Syria or Colombia or Myanmar or wherever these places of conflict are, Ukraine, where I went recently, somehow if you go into the situation, into the midst of the situation, there's a kind of aliveness that you feel because you are engaged with this. I feel alive because I'm engaged with the situation. If I just sit here and I know it's happening and I'm not doing anything about it, then actually there's a psychic load on me. So when I move in the direction, when I enter the flow, it keeps the spark alive. And the other thing I'll say is there are these moments when you are engaged in conversations with parties in conflict who have killed each other. And they are actually talking, they're engaging in some ways. First it may be very argumentative and it may be terrible, but there's a sense in which every moment of presence, every moment in which they engage, take one step of listening to each other, one little wall falls down, one little chink of the armor comes out. There's a light that pours through. It's almost as if where does the divine want to exist? The divine wants to exist in those moments when human beings who have these most incredible conflicts, when they start to take one step towards each other, that's when the light exists, and that can feed me, and that can feed everyone in the room. There's like a magic that happens, and that keeps me going.
So thank you, William. It's incredibly inspiring and so much wisdom. And I want to say that I really honor the availability to go into these difficult situations, even when it opens up and the light comes through. I think like souls like you going into these places I think it needs to be really honored that people give themselves to be in those situations and be screamed upon and be in those conflicted situations. So I deeply honor this in you, and I thank you very much for coming, and I send you lots of blessing for your path. It's an incredible path. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. And thank you, Thomas. It's my privilege to be able to be with you. And I invite you to join me. Come walk the Abraham path.
Yes, hopefully many people will come to walk the path. Thank you. Bye-bye.